And we are starting chapter 6 today. Chapter 6 is the flip side. All right, so maybe on the caption when I post a video on YouTube, I'll write the flip side, because we were talking about the godly soul, how it has 10 powers, 3 intellectual faculties, 7 emotional faculties, and now we're talking about the flip side, the side of klipa. So what exactly is its definition? What do its faculties do? What functions do they serve? Well, it looks like David's joining us indeed. So there's 3 parts to this chapter, and also a footnote. The first part talks about the intellect, the emotions, and the garments of the animal soul. We talked a lot about the garments of the godly soul last week. Then the distinction between the side of holiness and the side of the other side. And then we talk about the 3 impure klipos that have no good in them at all. And in the footnote, it discusses the infinite light of Hashem, how it fills the entire lowly earth. So starting with the intellect, the emotions, and the garments of the animal soul. By way of introduction, earlier on in chapter 1, the Alter Rebbe explained that every Jewish person has 2 souls. And the essence of one soul is klipa and sitra achra. The other, it's like a shell, a husk. It's otherly. And throughout the continuing chapters, the Alter Rebbe went on to explain, beginning with chapter 2, the essence of the godly soul, how it's literally a piece of God above. And in chapter 3 and 4, it goes into the various powers of the soul and how it connects and has a relationship with Hashem through learning Torah and doing mitzvahs. Now, in this chapter, we're going to start explaining the soul that comes from the klipa side. We're calling it the animal soul, the nefesh habahamis. And in the coming chapters, 7 and 8, he's going to explain how the nefesh habahamis serves to distance a person from godliness, to separate a person from godliness. So, Perek Vav, chapter 6, begins with fair game. Behold, this opposite this is what Hashem made. In other words, Hashem created the forces that oppose holiness in such a way that parallel to each type of holy power, Hashem created a similar, not equal, but similar power of impurity. And so that's why we're saying it's this opposite that, meaning there's a certain parallel. And the same is true with a individual person, that the animal soul is opposite, is opposed to, is parallel to the godly soul. And just like the godly soul has various powers through which a person can utilize those powers to connect himself to Hashem, in the side of klipa, likewise, there are similar powers which serve to separate a person from Hashem. Now, it's up to us to choose. And we're going to talk about that battle and more in chapter 9. The Alter Rebbe continues, for just as the godly soul is comprised of 10 holy sefirot, 10 holy faculties, and it is enclosed in, meaning it expresses itself through the 3 holy garments. Now, the godly powers are very refined powers that are attuned to and are receptacles of godliness. And these 10 soul powers, we explained, are a derivative and a devolution of God's 10 sefirot. So really, the human's godly soul possesses 10 powers that are derivative of God's 10 powers. And the godly soul also possesses 3 holy garments, meaning thought, speech, and deed, which is the means through which we study Torah and do mitzvahs. But everything has to be fair game. So too, the other soul, the soul of the other side, which comes from the shining klipa in the person's blood, kalula me'eser kisrin misavusa, comes from the 10 crowns of filth. Now, to be clear, the primary function of this animal soul enclosed in the blood of the person is literally to keep the blood flowing, to keep the person alive. However, more than just keeping the person alive, these 10 animal soul powers, also have an element to them that serves to oppose the holy powers. And these 10 powers come from the side of Tumah, from impurity. It's basically the 10, in Kabbalistic terms, it's the 10 crowns of impurity. Meaning they serve to defile a person and separate the person from godliness. Now, to get more specific, the Alter Rebbe continues, Shehein Sheva Midas Rais, which these are the 7 negative attributes, Habayis Me'arba Yisai Disraim Hanal, which come from the 4 above mentioned foundations. We said in chapter 1, there's fire, water, earth, and air. So that's the source of the 7 negative emotions. The Seichel HaMaylidan Hanachalak L'Shalish, and then there's the intellect, which gives birth to them, which is also divided into 3, Shehein Chachma Bina V'das Mekaramidas, which again is wisdom, understanding, and knowledge, the source of these emotions, these negative emotions. So just as the godly soul was divided into, the godly soul powers were divided into 2 categories, the 3 intellectual and the 7 emotional, so too with the animal soul, there are also these 2 categories, the 7 negative attributes and the mind that gives birth to those, which is the wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. So we can call it the godly soul has the good Chabad, and the animal soul has the bad Chabad. Not that Chabad is bad, but there's rotten apples in everything, right? So, for example, we said in chapter 1 that there are 4 foundations that lead to all the negative things, negative attributes, fire, water, earth, and air. And for example, the attribute, the emotion of anger or severity comes from the source of fire. Anger, you say a person gets fired up when he's very angry, right? Now you can get fired up in the positive sense. That's the godly soul. But the animal soul gets fired up and gets angry from the source of fire. Now, while there certainly is this relationship between intellect and emotions in the animal soul as well, as we'll see, it functions a little differently. But he says, the emotions are on par with the intellect. In other words, even though the animal soul has the intellect as the source of the emotions, but it works a little differently than the godly soul. You see, by the godly soul, without any introduction of intellect, there is no room for emotions, right? In order for a Jew to feel any feeling towards godliness, you have to have an understanding and a knowledge and awareness of godliness. Without that awareness, there are no emotions to speak of. And that's why we emphasize, when we're talking about the godly soul, we say that we talk about the intellect first and then the emotions. However, when we talk about the animal soul, the emotions of the animal soul could come about even without deep meditation, right? You don't have to think deeply to get angry when somebody hits your car. You're sitting in traffic, you're trying to get to work on time, and somebody hits your car. It doesn't take deep meditation to give birth to a feeling of anger, right? So all we're saying is that the emotions parallel the intellect. So what does that mean? The main characteristics of the animal soul in a person is the negative emotions. And therefore, when a person sees a good food and the tasteful food, he gets very excited towards that food. And he doesn't have to think, he doesn't have to meditate about the greatness of the food in order to give birth to a desire of that food. So then the question is, why by the animal soul? If the animal soul can give birth to emotions without any intellect, right, without any deep thought, so why are we saying that the intellect is still the source of the emotions? The answer is that the intellect is only the source of the emotion insofar as the extent of the emotions and the size of the emotions or the type of emotions will depend on the type of brain you have. So let's see an example of this. He brings examples from the three primary emotions of kindness, severity, and beauty. So he says, a child desires, remember, a child has a smaller brain than an adult, physically and also developmentally, right? A child desires and loves things that are very small and relatively petty. Because his intellect is smaller and more short range, and it doesn't have a perception of something greater than that. You know, it's funny, the other day, my wife was talking to my kids, and one of them said, you know, I want a big house like so-and-so, because they have 2 floors. And I was thinking, like, we were laughing because that 2-floor house is half the size of our house, right? But in their mind, 2 floors makes a big house. But anyways, right? Children have a certain perception of what's big and what's grand, you know, what's considered something big. So therefore, what they desire, because their intellect only goes so far, what they desire also is more limited. So in terms of the ability to desire, the animal soul has a natural draw towards things that give it pleasure. You don't have to think very deeply in order to have that feeling. However, to decide and establish what is something good, worth loving, and worth desiring, that depends on a person's intellect. So a child which does not understand and appreciate something that's good and great, they want things that are smaller. And the older a person gets, and the more they acquire more information, some would say the more your mind is corrupted. But anyways, their desires also grow, right? So for a child, when maybe their greatest excitement, the greatest gift you can get them is something valued at I don't know, $100 or a $400 what's it called, the video game, no, PlayStation. But for an adult, what's you know, what'll make their day? You buy him a private jet, right? It costs millions of dollars, or a yacht, you know. So does that mean that doesn't mean you're any wiser for that? It just means that your brain is bigger, and therefore your emotions desire all of those bigger things and more knowledge that you have. Now, that is in regard to the emotion of love, the emotion of desire. You desire a PlayStation, you desire a private jet, whatever it might be. But the same is with the negative, or I should say the gevura type of emotion. That's v'chein miskais umiskatzev mitvarim ketanim. A child, not only does he get excited and love towards smaller things, but he also gets angry and upset from smaller things, right? You turned over my French fry upside down, and now I'm going to throw a tantrum. That's a child. For a person, a chair, okay, mela, a car, whatever, you could buy a new car. My house turned upside down, maybe I'll get a little upset, right? So based on the size of the brain, that's where you'll see an emotional reaction, either a bigger reaction or a smaller reaction. Or I should say, reacting to something bigger or reacting to something smaller. V'chein beisparos, also in pride, which is the midah of tiferes, the child takes pride in smaller things. Yesterday, my 3-year-old was able to throw the paper towel from the sink into the garbage can. And that was like the greatest accomplishment of the day, right? But for us, we have to throw the 3-pointer with a big, heavy basketball, which weighs however much and it's 10 feet high in the air, right? We're not satisfied with throwing a napkin into the garbage from 3 feet away. That doesn't make us proud. So what we see here is that the feelings, the emotions of the animal soul is based on the brain. Again, it doesn't go through the brain necessarily. The feelings just come without any, premeditated deep thoughts, but they do reflect the size of the brain and the development of the brain. So the point is, we have 10 soul powers that come from Klippa, which oppose the 10 soul powers of the godly soul. Now he's going to say that this applies not only to the soul powers, but also to the soul garments of thought, speech, and deed. That just as the godly soul has 3 holy garments, which are utilized by the 10 soul powers, so to the other side, the animal soul has 3 impure garments, which are thought, speech, and deed, initiated by Klippa, whose function is to separate a person from godliness. As the Alter Rebbe continues to say, the Eser Bechines Elu Hatmeyos, and these 10 impure faculties, Kisha'adam mechashiv bahen, when a person thinks through them, oy medaber, or speaks, oy oise, or does, like for example, when a person gets excited with a negative desire, something that comes from the love expressed by the animal soul, that causes a person to think about that desire and then to talk about how he's going to carry out that desire, and at the end, God forbid, performs that forbidden act, all through these 3 garments of thought, speech, and deed. So in each stage of thought, speech, and deed of the animal soul, one of the soul's 10 faculties, one of the animal soul's 10 faculties is expressed through that. So the thought in his mind and the speech in his mouth, and the power of action in his hands, and the rest of his limbs, now these are called filthy garments or impure garments. Garments which are enclothing these 10 impure faculties, which are enclothing themselves in these dirty garments while it's thinking, speaking, or doing. So when a person enclothes one of the powers of his animal soul into thought, speech, or deed, that thought or that speech or that deed are called a impure garment of the animal soul. In other words, the soul itself, the animal soul itself, is enwrapped, is covered in this garment. Because you have the soul's powers as they are, as a power, as a potential state. The animal soul has 10 powers. But when you bring that power into actuality meaning into the garments of thought, speech, and deed, by thinking, speaking, or doing something that he desired, then the impurity in these garments actually penetrate the animal soul itself, and the soul becomes separated from godliness because it attached itself to something that stands for and represents and is all about opposing godliness. So, to summarize, the powers of the other soul, of the animal soul, of the Sitra Achra soul, oppose the powers of the godly soul. Just as a godly soul has 10 powers and 3 garments, so too the soul that vivifies the body and keeps the body alive has also 10 powers, 3 of intellect, 7 of emotion. Not that they're necessarily directed by the intellect, but they certainly reflect the size of the intellect. And these 10 powers have 3 garments of thought, speech, and deed, in which it encloses itself every time it does something that is fulfilling the desire of the animal soul. So the good news is, I know we talked a lot about negative things and impure things, but the good news is that we have freedom of choice. We can choose which soul we want to engage, which powers we want to utilize, what kind of thought, speech, and deed we're able to do. And we'll end off on that positive note that we should choose the good.